So I really came to feel that what I was learning in science wasn't the truth about the nature of the mind, the nature of the brain, and the nature of the human soul. So I started reading Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and a lot of Christian theology and Christian psychology, and came to understand the relationship between the soul and the body in a very different way.
This new book, I think, would be the most helpful, especially if you're in this science area. And even though we're going to be talking about science, I think you're going to find it easy to follow. The book is entitled The Immortal Mind, A Neurosurgeon's Case for the Existence of the Soul. Dr. Michael Egnor, we have information about him and the book. Also, his particular speech that he gave at the 2025 Dallas Conference on Science and Faith on Is the Soul Real? And the co-author is Denyse O'Leary, individual we've quoted many times before because of her book, The Spiritual Brain. Let me go and try to introduce both of those. First of all, Dr. Egnor is not only a professor of neurosurgery and pediatrics at the Renaissance School of Medicine at Stony Brook University, also has his medical degree from Columbia University, but most importantly, as I just mentioned a minute ago, a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center for Natural and Artificial Intelligence. And in addition to having information about his book on the website, we also have some information about the speech that he gave recently, just down the road from where we're broadcasting here today at the Dallas Conference on Science and Faith. So, Dr. Egnor, thank you so very much for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me.
And I've already kind of introduced Denyse O'Leary, individual we talk about and certainly have benefited from her book, The Spiritual Brain, A Neuroscientist's Case for the Existence of Soul. And Denyse, welcome back to Point of View.
I really exist. I'm not an avatar.
Well, let's, if we can, Dr. Egnor, get your story first. As I said before we were able to connect up with you, we've been talking about some of this with J.P. Moreland's book, The Dualism in the Soul, even Lee Strobel's latest book, Seeing the Supernatural. But you kind of begin with, if you will, not only a scientific pilgrimage of starting to believe in the soul, but a spiritual pilgrimage from atheist to Christian. Can you share that with us?
Certainly. I was born and raised in a household that didn't really have religion. My mother took me to church on rare occasions when I was a kid, but I wasn't baptized. And I fell in love with science as a young child, and I desperately wanted to be a scientist, and then ultimately wanted to be a doctor. I majored in biochemistry in college. I went to medical school, and I fell in love with neuroscience. I fell in love with the anatomy of the brain and the physiology of the brain. And I thought that would really help me understand what it meant to be human, to understand how the mind worked. And I remained an atheist. I never had any hostility to Christians. I wasn't an angry atheist. I thought Christianity was a nice thing, and Christians were nice people. I just thought it was a myth. I didn't think it was scientific. And a couple of things happened to me in my personal life. I began having these episodes where I used to call them hauntings, where I would just start thinking about, like, why am I here? What's the purpose for my life? Where did I come from? Sort of obvious questions. And I really wanted an answer to it. I didn't think that Christianity could offer the answer, but I knew that there should be an answer to it. Then I have 4 kids. When my youngest child was born, we were concerned that he was autistic when he was a baby. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't smile. And so we took him to a doctor. They said they really couldn't be sure. We'd have to wait and see. And this was agony for me, because I was concerned that if he was severely autistic, he might not even know me, might not even love me. And that was a very painful thing. So one night I was seeing a patient in a Catholic hospital. And when I got done seeing the patient, I was really upset emotionally. And there was a chapel there. So I went in the chapel, and I got down in front of the altar and I prayed. And I said, God, I don't know if you really exist, but in fact, I don't think you do exist, but you're my last hope here. Please don't let my son be autistic. I can't take the idea that he wouldn't know me, that he wouldn't love me. And I heard a voice, only time in my life I've ever heard a voice, and the voice said, "But that's what you're doing to me." And I collapsed. I said, "All right, Lord, I won't do it to you anymore." Next morning, I called the church and said, "How can I get baptized as soon as possible?" And my family, and we worked things out. And I went. A couple days later was my son's 6-month birthday, and went home to the little party, and he was perfectly normal. He was smiling and making eye contact with the normal baby.
Yeah.
So I went through a kind of Damascus Road experience, but I also saw in my care of patients, when I would take care of people who had serious brain problems, that many of the patients I had, their minds didn't connect to their brain well. That is that, for example, I had a little girl who was born missing half or 2/3 of her brain. And I told her family that she probably wouldn't do very well, that she was going to have a lot of trouble. And she's grown up completely normal, perfectly fine, missing major parts of her brain. And I've seen that with quite a few patients. I've done awake brain surgery where we operate on people when they're awake. We use local anesthesia so they don't feel pain. And we do it to map the surface of the brain so we can identify critical areas so that we don't damage them when we're taking out tumors, for example, treating seizures. And one patient was a lady who had a brain tumor that was infiltrating much of her left frontal lobe. And I was taking out the tumor, including a substantial part of the left frontal lobe of her brain, while I was talking to her. And she was under the surgical drapes, and we had a nice conversation for several hours as I was removing parts of her brain. And that wasn't in any of my textbooks. When you go back to the neuroanatomy and neurophysiology textbooks, there's no way you could remove parts of a person's brain without affecting them. So I really came to feel that what I was learning in science wasn't the truth about the nature of the mind, the nature of the brain, and the nature of the human soul. So I started reading Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and a lot of Christian theology and Christian psychology, and came to understand the relationship between the soul and the body in a very different way.
Denyse O'Leary, let me come to you because, of course, you've written The Spiritual Brain, but one of the things I mentioned just a minute ago was Wilder Penfield. I remember when we first published a book years ago around here by Arthur Custance, The Mysterious Matter of Mind. That goes back 45 years. But at that time, Wilder Penfield had just died. But the fact is that you can, with the brain open, as Dr. Egnor was pointing out, touch certain parts of the brain. And I remember one story where they moved the hand, and he said, "Well, why'd you move the hand?" He said, "I didn't. You made me move it." And it's like you have the brain is a computer, but there's somebody watching the computer, and that's argument really for a spiritual brain, isn't there?
Well, that's what Penfield came to think. Now, Mike knows way more about all that than I do because he actually does brain surgery. But Penfield wrestled most of his life, I think, with the question. And finally, toward the end, he wrote a book, The Mystery of the Mind, which I believe was published the year before his death, 1975,
right,
in which he essentially said, in a kind of a non-dramatic way, that the mind was not simply the brain. Now, that did not receive much publicity because the other way is the way you're supposed to think, as poor old Christoph Koch found out the hard way. But yes, he was for one of the linchpins of the Montreal Neurological Institute.
You know, Dr. Enger, you were talking about the fact that sometimes you can have half a brain. I remember the old joke by Dr. Ben Carson. I've actually worked with people that have half a brain, and that was before I went to Congress and dealt with them. But nevertheless, the point is that there are sometimes people can lose half their brain and they're still functioning. And that's why you have a section early on that the brain can be split, but not the mind. Or another example that you use is when a person maybe is unconscious and then regains consciousness after being unresponsive, they actually have a mind again. And that really seems to be a very strong argument against the idea that the mind is just an outgrowth of the brain. It seems to be a pretty powerful argument for there being a mind and a soul. Can you explain?
Yes. The split brain research is absolutely fascinating there's an operation that was developed back in the 1940s in which the hemispheres of the brain were split apart.
Mm-hmm.
And the split is almost complete. There's virtually very, very little connection left between the two hemispheres. And this was to prevent the spread of seizures. And patients did much, much better with their seizures when the brain was split. Surprisingly, when patients have this operation done, and I've done the operation, they're perfectly normal afterwards. That is, that it would be almost as if you took a chainsaw and cut your computer in half and found that it really worked just fine. There was no problem with it even being cut in half. So that was a very strange thing. There was a researcher named Roger Sperry who studied these patients very, very carefully and developed techniques of showing pictures to the individual hemispheres separately. And he did find that there were some minor perceptual disabilities that these people had after their brains were split that correlated with the splitting. But for all intents and purposes, these people were perfectly normal. And what that implies is that there is a soul that these people have that is not split with a knife. That is, that your soul is not the same thing as your brain.
Right.
And there's even recent research that absolutely fascinates me, where people can compare images. People who've had split brain surgery, you show one picture to one hemisphere, another picture to the other hemisphere, and then you ask them to compare them, and they can compare them quite accurately. The interesting thing is that no part of their brain has seen both pictures. So what is it that's doing the comparing?
Fascinating.
It's the soul.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating research.
One of the things I wanted to come to you, Denyse, is what is called paradoxical lucidity. That's a big, long word, but it has to do with the fact that you had an aged father diagnosed with dementia. I can relate to that because that's exactly what I had to deal with my father as well. Did not really notice his surroundings, but then in the midst of that showed a shocking amount of lucidity. First of all, tell the story, because I think that is another, powerful argument for a mind and a brain as well, a mind that's separate from the brain. Can you explain?
Well, my father was in his late 90s, and he was living in a care home across the street from me, and I visited him every day. As you say, he had dementia and was, not aware the way he would have been when he was young of what was going on. But one day he quite shocked me. My back was to him, and he said in a very clear way, people who have dementia often don't speak clearly, but in this case he did. He said, "Denyse, when I'm gone, you won't have to work so hard anymore."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, what? It was true, but to actually hold that idea in his mind, he had to suddenly, at that point, be aware of a number of different things. Who I was, that he had an estate, that I was one of his heirs, that on his death I would inherit money, and could actually have a bit of an easier life. But you see, that wasn't the only time he showed paradoxical lucidity, and it was just the one that's easiest to explain, because you don't need to know anything about our family to know that. Mm-hmm. I looked it up, and apparently this is studied by neuroscientists. Nobody knows how it is that people with dementia can suddenly become lucid for a short period.
Yes.
They say it happens shortly before death, but in my dad's case, it was 2 years before his death. Mm-hmm. Approximately. And and of course, what I don't know is, because people who have dementia don't tend to be visited nearly as often as others, is it true that it mostly happens just before death, or is it more the case that people gather when they know that someone is dying, and so they're more likely to hear it? I simply don't know. And by the way, I'm not the only person to raise that question, because in one study, the researchers raised it.
Right. So, and in one of the studies, 124 people with dementia, more than 80% experienced this lucidity, a complete remission with return of memory, orientation, everything. Dr. Egnor, that just, again, I think is a powerful argument for the fact that there's something beyond the brain that is working to all of a sudden recognize your surroundings, your circumstances, and everything, and provide at least a momentary time of lucidity. And anybody that's been around a deathbed has seen that before.
Yes, it's relatively common that people have those experiences. Another fascinating experience that is related to that is research done by Adrian Owen, who's a scientist who was working in Cambridge, England, back about 20 years ago. Took patients who had what's called persistent vegetative state, and that's basically the deepest level of coma. And he put them in MRI machines, and he did something called functional MRI imaging, where he could look at patterns of activation of the brain. But these patients had almost completely destroyed brains. There's a little bit of brain tissue there, but not much. And he would ask them questions in the machine, and their brains would light up on the MRI scan, indicating that they were able to understand what he was asking. And he got to a point, and this has been replicated by many researchers, where he could converse with people in the deepest level of coma. So their minds are functioning remarkably well, given that their brains are almost completely destroyed, which is what you would expect if the soul has an independent existence from the brain.
If you'd like to know more about either of these particular authors, we have links on our website. We have information about this book, as well as a video that you might want to watch of the presentation that Dr. Egnor did on Is the Soul Real?, which occurred at the 2025 Dallas Conference on Science and Faith, which is all part of the Discovery Institute. Dr. Egnor, let's, if we can, get into an argument that I'd never even thought about, and that is what happens when you have two minds that must share body parts, because we have this situation of conjoined twins, but in the case of these two girls in British Columbia, they are joined at the head. A separation essentially is impossible, but it gives us an insight in the difference between the brain and the mind, doesn't it?
Yes, it's absolutely fascinating. Their names are Krista and Tatiana Hogan, and they live in British Columbia, and they're now young ladies. And they were born joined at the brain, actually. And they have something called a thalamic bridge, which is a part of the brain that connects their two brains. So they share many sensory and motor functions. For example, they can see out of each other's eyes. They can feel each other's skin. They share control of several of each other's limbs. But what they don't share is their personalities. They're rather different people. They have two completely different centers of consciousness. They have debates and fights. They don't agree on things. And what it suggests is that there are parts of the mind and of the soul that are intimately linked to the brain, and that you could, in theory, share with someone else, like vision or cessation or even movement. But there are also parts of your soul, your sense of yourself, your spiritual self, your intellect, your will, that are uniquely yours. And it, again, is evidence that the soul is not the same thing as the brain, that we have a spiritual soul.
Wow. That chapter is very interesting, but it now brings us to a section that, Denyse, I'd love to talk to you about. Of course, you wrote The Spiritual Brain, but a lot of the argument, I think, that we've developed on this whole idea is that the brain seems to transcend what might be considered death, or at least what some people would refer to as a momentary action that would be considered death. And whether it's Lee Strobel in his book, Is God Real?, Seeing the Supernatural, or even Dinesh D'Souza and all sorts of others, we certainly have quite a bit of evidence of the human mind existing beyond death, don't we?
Well, yes. And here's the really interesting thing. Oh, by the way, Mario Beauregard, a neuroscientist in Montreal, was the first author of The Spiritual Brain. I was the second author.
Sure.
But what's happened in recent years is that there's a great deal of medical knowledge and evidence of the ability of the mind to function when the brain is apparently clinically dead.
Right.
Remember that at one time, concepts of near-death experiences were something that you might hear from mediums and people who attended spiritualist seances and things like that, right? Well, what happened with modern medicine is doctors found ways of bringing people back from clinical states of death. And Mike can tell you about an extreme example, but the person would come back and say, I saw a spaghetti stain on your tie. That really happened to Dr. Bruce Grayson. He'd been trying to conceal it from colleagues, but when the patient who had been brought back after a suicide attempt from a state of clinical death was explaining that she had received information that caused her to realize she mustn't attempt suicide anymore, she'd also noticed a spaghetti stain on his tie. So that's when he became interested in near-death experiences. He hadn't been previously, or so he says in his book. But that's just an example. But my point is, it's reached the point where you can talk about it in a clinic or an intensive care room rather than something that people can debate around in parlors, if you see what I mean. So one thing that told me that why things are changing is some of the papers I've seen on near-death experiences, a large number of doctors have signed on to them. Some of the articles are published in medical journals.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking people aren't running to every door and window to get away from this because it's just crazy. It's something they're beginning to accept. In fact, when it came out at my church that I was the second author of this book, several people flagged me down and said, well, you know, I don't usually talk about this, but I had a near-death experience. And it did sound like they had had a near-death experience. Yes, I'm surprised. But what I'm mainly surprised by is that it's now something that we can talk about as a normal type of thing that you can discuss in science. Psychology Today, a publication that I would describe as fairly trendy, has published a number of articles sympathetic to the idea that something is going on. Just for example.
And again, I remember, Dr. Egnor, when I wrote back in 1980, we had Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, had Raymond Moody, had Kenneth Ring, and that was still kind of on the periphery. But as I think Denyse O'Leary has made the case, almost everybody's talking about that now, sometimes in refereed scientific journals. Of course, I just quoted a minute ago Lee Strobel in both his latest books, Is God Real and Seeing the Supernatural. He uses examples which are easily verifiable that they were able to see things that they would not have known if indeed there wasn't a soul that was separate from the body. They wouldn't have seen things, they would not have heard things because these happened outside of their particular environment. And so as a result, that I think is now becoming another powerful argument for the soul, isn't it?
Yes. I think it's becoming scientifically much more recognized as something that is worthy of scientific research and has a lot of evidence supporting it. What characterizes these experiences that materialist explanations can't really account for is that these people have very clear, organized experiences. They have life reviews. They have a conscious decision to return to their body at the end of going down the tunnel. They have perception of things in the room around them while their brain is dead, and they can see things often very, very clearly. In addition, the scientific literature shows that the people that are met by the experiencer on the other end of the tunnel are always dead people. That is, that as far as I know, there's not been a single report of a living person seen on the other side in heaven, even if the experiencer did not know the person was dead.
Yes, I've seen that where they said, why is that person there? Because they've been kept from knowing that person died. Yes.
Right. And these are transformative experiences. People's lives change radically after this.
Yes.
There was a patient named Pam Reynolds who underwent brain surgery in 1991 in a very unusual operation where they had to stop her heart, drain the blood out of her brain in order to fix an aneurysm. They cooled her body down to keep her brain from being destroyed by this, and then rewarmed her, started her heart again, and so on. And during this process, she left her body. She watched the operation from the ceiling of the room. She knew the conversations the doctors had.
Just
she knew
amazing.
the music that was playing on the radio. And she had a tunnel experience, went into heaven, came back. All of this is very well documented.
Yes. I thought we'd get into free will. And of course, this issue of free will denialism is quite rampant. And we'll pick on Jerry Coyne for just a minute, evolutionist that argues, well, we're just a biological computer. We have a meat computer in our brains, but everything is deterministic. There is no free will. And it does seem to me that we have, Dr. Egnor, all sorts of very good evidence of free will. Of course, we have the problem that even denying the existence of free will is sort of a self-refuting argument. But help us out, because you've devoted a chapter to that, and that's another very important issue, because if we don't have free will, then my booklet I wrote recently on the criminal justice system is a farce, because then there's no liability, no culpability, and quite frankly, we just kind of live in a world where we say, well, I was just predetermined to do that. We don't hold people accountable in that world, and that just simply doesn't work in terms of our own experience. But what have you found?
Yes, I certainly agree with you. Free will, there are several reasons why free will is obviously real. The first is that everyone believes in free will, meaning everyone lives their life like free will is real. Even people who deny free will act like free will is real. Jerry Coyne, for example, is a biologist who's an atheist who doesn't believe in free will, put up a post about someone denting his fender in a parking lot, and he was quite angry this guy dented his fender. And I pointed out online that if this person didn't have any free will, the person had no more choice about denting his fender than the car had. The other reason is that, as you had mentioned, the denial of free will is self-refuting. That is, if you're saying that you're really just a meat robot and you don't have any voluntary control over what you do, why would anybody pay any attention to you? Why would anybody listen to what you say if you can't freely choose to tell the truth? There's also a great deal of neuroscience that supports the reality of free will. People have studied activity in the brain when people are making choices, and there clearly is room for freely choosing, and not everything comes directly from the brain. And Wilder Penfield, who we spoke about earlier,
right,
did very interesting research on free will, where he could not find a free will region of the brain that he could stimulate to make the person do things that the person thought he was doing freely.
Right.
In other words, the will was an immaterial part of the soul.
Yes. Very good arguments. And just before I run out of time, Denyse, I wanted to come back to you, because a lot of people might say, well, this is kind of a little more difficult book to understand, although it's very readable. So I think, first of all, I want to allay that concern that I wouldn't understand it. I think you'd understand it very well. But how could somebody use this? Because having been the co-author of a previous book, Spiritual Brain, now the co-author of this book, it seems to me, as I suggested, this could be used to maybe challenge some of the assumptions that our skeptical, atheistic friends might have, and this might open a door. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I think you're right. One of my concerns is I don't believe that, based on what we know about science today, which includes neuroscience, there's any justification for what's sometimes called the presumption of atheism, or the presumption of materialism. Like, so often neuroscientists will be interviewed and they'll say, one of these days we're going to find out the spot for consciousness in the brain, or it's all in the prefrontal cortex, or something like that. And of course, there's a lot of talk, and then you hear a little bit later, well, a recent massive neuroscience study didn't come to any conclusion about which of two major theories was the best theory, but what they did discover was that apparently the prefrontal cortex wasn't as big a deal as everybody thought. So I went and looked it up, and sure enough, that's what everybody did think. So I'm thinking, you know what? These people are on the wrong track. I mean, when it gets to that point, you have to wonder whether there's something about the science that they're not facing up to. And my suggestion is they're not facing up to the reality that our minds are immaterial. If they don't believe anything can be immaterial, then I don't know how they manage to do or work with mathematics, because if there was ever a subject that's immaterial, that's it, right?
Well said.
So, yeah, well, it's true. The same people who would boast to you that they're very good mathematicians also want us to believe that everything is material. And I'm thinking, I think we need to sit down and look at some of these people's presuppositions and say, but I don't know why that should rule. I don't know why you are looking for the consciousness spot in the brain. You can if you want, but I have a feeling that 20 years from now, we'll be exactly where we were 50 years ago. Because I think you're looking for the wrong thing.
Very good. Dr. Egnor, again, I might come to you as well, because the reason you wrote this book is because you have dug into the science, and you argued before that you thought science could explain everything, but we recognize, whether we look at the history of the scientific method or the great leaders of scientists who were oftentimes theists themselves, you see, I believe, no contradiction between your biblical convictions and your scientific enterprise. If nothing else, I think those are coming together in very remarkable ways, aren't they?
Absolutely. There is no contradiction between good science and faith, because good science speaks the truth, and faith is the truth. I, in fact, use my inference to design in the world. In my own research in my university, I'm studying blood flow to the brain, and I have used the inference that the way the blood flows to the brain is a design system. And the design of it actually has yielded a great many insights into how blood flow works in the brain that one wouldn't have if you didn't assume that it was a design system.
Yes.
So the inference to design, the inference to the reality of the soul, makes science much, much better.
Well, again, intelligent design, something we talk about so often here on Point of View, and of course something they talk about at the Discovery Institute. Just before I run out of time, let me just mention again that the book, if you would like to know about it, is entitled The Immortal Mind. It's just now coming out, so you're hearing about it even maybe before some of them have landed in the bookstore. If you look at the various endorsements coming from all sorts of people that we've had on this program, like Sean McDowell and George Gilder, as well as Nancy Piercy and a variety of other individuals, Bill Dembski. So again, I think you will find the book very helpful. I think it is one that really could begin to challenge some of the non-Christian and atheistic and materialistic assumptions of some of your friends, neighbors, coworkers, even family members. And so we have that information on our website at pointofview.net. Let me also point you to a video. It is entitled The Scientific Evidence of the Human Soul. It was the message that was given by Dr. Egnor at the 2025 Dallas Conference on Science and Faith. I think you'll enjoy watching that, and it might be something you might want to pass on to others as well. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.